it is a wonderful pleasure to finally get to visit this superb parish about which I've heard so much. Was all set to come last year at the end of March, and as you know, a slight change happened in our country about that. So, but gee, here we are together. It's wonderful. I suppose I knew of Redeemer when I was at St. Thomas because we had some boys in our choir school there, and I also gathered that the choir had come here in Sons. Anyway, so this it feels really, really good to be here today. I wrote this book, Losing Susan, not because my situation was particularly hard or unusual. It's really not either particularly hard or unusual. I'm sure the situation of many of you, perhaps, certainly many people I've talked to, is not that different. But I wrote it because I'm a priest, and it seemed to me that, that not only am I a priest, but one who wants to be a sincere priest, one who has also been the beneficiary over the years of much love and concern given to me by members of my congregations. So in a sense, I wanted to offer that back. And I thought that people would be interested in knowing what a priest would say about or think about as he was going through stuff that many people themselves go through. You know, you guys always talk about God, but do you really believe it when it comes home to you? That kind of thing. So a bit of my story. My wife died just before Christmas of 2012. She was 57. We had met in college, which was St. John's in Santa Fe. We married right after college. We had 2 children, one before seminary and one during seminary. Seminary was general in New York City. After seminary, we lived in the Hudson Valley of New York for about 20 years. I was a curate in one parish and then rector in another. We lived in Pennsylvania then for about 1.5 years. I was an assistant professor at a small college, and then back to New York City, which was in 2005. I was theologian in residence at St. Thomas. We were married, all told, 34 years. It was 15 years into our marriage that Susan's brain tumor was found. She lived another 19 years after that, and she died of brain disease, not of cancer. Her cancer had been successfully treated, but the treatments had injured her brain and set it on a slow decline. An important part of my story is that the things I most believe as a priest are pretty much inseparable from Susan. I don't have, as it were, can't really identify for you sort of my own independent, deep beliefs. It was love of God that brought us together at the beginning and continued, at least as what we aspired to have, as the truth of our household. Just another kind of comment along the way, perhaps I should note that there are things in the book that are more personal than I would normally have shared with a general audience. But they are there because I thought if this is to be helpful to others, then it needs to be honest and sort of open, sort of forthright. So I thought today I would read to you a couple of excerpts from the book. One's from the beginning, the other is towards the end. And then we'll have time for you all to ask me questions if you want. I can read more too, but I imagine you'll have questions. Susan wrote little that was published, but she was a gifted writer. She had a few powerful essays published in the Human Life Review. It was back before seminary and sort of during seminary that she was published there. She wrote many children's stories, all of which were unpublished until losing Susan. And one of her stories is as an appendix to the book. Rusty Reno had me talk about the book at First Things, at the office of First Things, and beforehand he said to me, you know, the best writing in the book is Susan's. I think it's true. Susan loved children, and so this is a section that I called More Children. Susan noticed an ad in the local paper. The county social services agency was looking for foster parents. She inquired and found that one could set limits on the children one could take. In particular, it would be possible for us to say that we'd only take babies. She persuaded me that this would be a good thing for us to do. I certainly agreed that it would be a good thing to do, and that Susan would find particular fulfillment in it. So we went to the training sessions and got ourselves and our home certified. This has been an exciting and busy year for us. She began our 1989 Christmas letter. In February, we completed the massive process of becoming certified as foster parents. We had started last October. And 2 days later, we had our first foster child. Ramon came to us straight out of the hospital, 3 days old, so I quickly got back into the up-all-night routine. He was only 5 pounds, and I wore him in the Snuggly everywhere I went, including all the services of Holy Week. Right after that, social services reclaimed him, and he left us, by that time over 7 pounds, and with a lovely smile. I have since heard that he has been adopted and is still full of smiles. Our next foster child, Jonathan, came in May. He was 5 months old, and if Ramon was tiny, Jonathan was and is enormous. Jonathan was very difficult at first. He was a constant and inconsolable screamer, so we paced many a floor with him. But gradually that wore away, and he is now a generally cheerful boy with charm in buckets. He is still with us. We have seen him learn to sit up, crawl, acquire 6 teeth, stand, walk, and say tree. He will probably go back to his family within a month, and then won't it be quiet around here? That is, until social services gives us the next one. Over about 3 years, we had 9 children altogether, only one at a time, and some for just a couple of weeks, but some, like Jonathan, for 6 or 9 months or more. The social services agency particularly liked us because, since we were not looking to adopt, our interests were purely to care for these children for the time we had them, without other complicating motives. And I was rereading this. What I mean is they didn't worry about us, trying to run away with the child when they were trying to take it back. Susan, being a stay-at-home mother, did most of the caregiving. That was her desire and her fulfillment. Here is how our son recalls it in words he spoke at the interment of his mother's ashes in Santa Fe some 25 years later. I remember one child in particular, not Jonathan, who would scream when he woke up or was hungry, and he wouldn't stop for anything, being picked up anything. He had been born to a woman who didn't want others to know that she'd had a baby, so she'd leave him in the car while she was in work, and he didn't know that crying made any difference. He was loved by Mama, and he learned to stop crying when he was picked up. Mama, like Mary, loved the sufferer and always was a comfort to the afflicted. There were also crack babies, a girl with only part of an ear, a boy whose father had dislocated his shoulder, and so forth. They came to us while their mother or parents dealt with their addictions or other issues. We knew that none of these children would ever remember us, and we knew that often they would return to homes that still had big problems. But Susan would say that deep in their souls, they would have a memory of being held, touched, cradled, cleaned, fed, and in general, being loved. She believed that such a deep memory would not be lost, and had the capacity to change a person's life for good. I can't recall why our foster parenting came to an end around 1992, but it had concluded before the late spring of 1993 when Susan's tumor was found. We had lots of pictures of these babies. Along the way, Susan collected one of each child and put it into a small photo album. When a couple of decades later, our young friend and aspiring actor, Andrew, was helping her with exercise and trying to get her to talk more, he learned about these children and got her to find and show him the picture book. It's my sense that in her years of increasing silence, when it was difficult for her to concentrate long enough to formulate her thoughts into spoken words, her soul often thought about these children. Quietly, of course, it was pro-life work and witness. She was one of those people she had written about in the Human Life Review who shows it is a good thing to be merciful to those in her power. But pro-life witness is not why Susan got us into foster care. She got us into it because the babies needed us and we could help. What would God have us learn about love and disease? In the prayer book translation, I have been impressed by this phrase, our heart's desire, or your heart's desire. It occurs 4 times in the Psalms, in the prayer book translation. And it occurs in this way, about God giving you your heart's desire. When I got a chance to teach at a college and was leaving the Hudson Valley, a neighboring priest said to me, "He's giving you your heart's desire." And I did have a deep desire to teach, but I hadn't actually framed it in that way. Almost from the time I first saw her, Susan was my heart's desire, and God did indeed give her to me. God fulfilled his promise. But God also takes away what he gives. My title for this book, as I was writing it, the title in my head was Brain Disease and the Priest's Wife, which I thought would be interesting, like Jack and the Beanstalk, you know? You're setting out 2 things, and then how's the story going to unfold? The publisher said, and they came up with Losing Susan. My daughter said, but it's not just about losing Mama, but we couldn't come up with anything better. It's certainly a prettier title. But in the subtitle, they got this, Brain Disease, the Priest's Wife, and the God who gives and takes away. So that's what I'm focusing on. The God who gives. He gives you your heart's desire, but he also takes away what he gives. We can't get God off the hook about evil. Any sort of neat philosophical way of dealing with the problem of evil that gets God off the hook is inadequate. We also can't blame God, but we can't get him off the hook. I have some stuff on that in the book. We can talk more about it later if you want, but I want right now to draw your attention to something that happens every time we celebrate Holy Communion. In the Eucharist, God takes something. We give to God bread. God breaks the bread. That is, the priest breaks it, but the bread is broken. And then God gives it back to us. So it's taken, it's broken, and it's giving back. This happens every time we have the Eucharist, and it's a sort of pattern for what happens in life. We offer, God has given us something, it's given over to God and broken. And then in some new way, it is given back to us. the subtitle is inadequate in not going on to say, and returns, the God who gives and takes away and gives back. You could also say that. That's true. But we don't want to skip over the reality of the God who takes away. That is, I don't want to, in any sense, to deny that God does give back. But it is important for us not to be afraid to acknowledge the middle part, where God breaks. So let me read you, this is the second thing I want to read. It's towards the end. We'd been just on a visit to our son and his wife and our grandchildren who were in Phoenix, and we'd been back for a day when Susan fell on the way to the bathroom. It happened like this. She had been taking her nap when I found her standing beside the bed, incontinent. I urged her to get moving, to move faster. I went ahead to get the toilet ready for her when I heard it. She had pivoted on one foot and fallen backwards, her head loudly thunking on a closet door. I found her on her back on the floor, her head up against the door. She was awake, she wasn't bleeding, she could speak. I helped her stand. We continued to the toilet. But while seated there, she became unresponsive. She didn't reply to anything I said. Her head was turned away from me to the wall. Her focus was on the toilet paper. She put a hand to the paper. She sat. She didn't reply. It can still haunt my memory. Why did she fall? Why wasn't I with her? When the ambulance arrived, her seizure was over, and the drivers would not take her to the NYU hospital where her records were, but insisted on going elsewhere to yet another hospital, one at which Susan would be a patient without previous medical records and with an unknown history, apart from what I could verbally communicate. At this hospital, it was thought that she might have had a heart event or a stroke, which I couldn't deny was a theoretical possibility. In 2 days, her heart tests being all negative, Susan was better and released to home. If only the ambulance had taken her to NYU, if only at that time an MRI had been done of her brain, what might have been found? When the next week her neurologist saw her, he said to get an MRI just to make sure nothing was wrong. He said that to us calmly, but I heard him say to the scheduler that it should be done ASAP. The day of the MRI was the last day Susan spoke a word. It began with physical therapy at home. Because of the hospital visit, she had been authorized for home therapy. Susan was tired from that, and the friend who was with her that morning told me when I came home shortly after noon that they had eaten an early lunch and Susan had gone down for a nap. I woke her up later and we got into a cab to go to the hospital where the MRI equipment was. Susan was moving slowly. We had a 4 o'clock appointment. I was afraid we'd be late. Can't you walk a little faster? I was cross. We checked in for the appointment and then sat down to wait. Rather, I sat down. Susan was just being slow, and I thought that if I left her at the desk, she would see her way to come sit by me. She finally did. They were running very much behind schedule. Susan kept falling asleep in the chair in an uncomfortable posture, leaning over herself. Around 5 o'clock, I told the clerk my wife was exceedingly tired and asked if she might lie down somewhere while we waited. They were accommodating and put her on a stretcher in a back room. At last, she was taken for the MRI. Afterwards, with Susan reclining again on the stretcher, we had to wait for a neurosurgeon intern to come and reprogram her shunt, which was, at least theoretically, needed resetting after the MRI. When that was finally over, I sat beside Susan holding her. She was hardly responding to anything. The stretcher lost its balance. We ended up on the floor. Someone came in and helped us get up. Then a nurse came in to check Susan. There seemed to be no harm, just this strangeness that she wasn't being responsive. Since it was now 8 in the evening, we really wanted to go home, So they offered us a wheelchair to take to the street for a taxi. I had Susan in the wheelchair, and we were crossing the largely empty lobby. It occurred to me that her problems with slowness might have to do with lack of food. But the Argo tea shop, where we could have gotten a salad or a muffin, was now closed. I got a package of peanut M&Ms from a vending machine. I gave Susan a couple. I don't remember if she put them in her mouth or if I did. She smiled at me. I was sitting in a chair facing her in her wheelchair. "You have M&Ms in your mouth," I said. She smiled. "Don't you want to swallow them?" I said. She smiled. It dawned on me that on the other side of this hospital complex there was an emergency room. I hated the thought of not going home, but it seemed prudent at least to call Susan's neurologist before we left. The attending doctor called me back in just a few minutes. Grasping the essential ambiguity of the situation, he said we could either go home or go to the ER. I chose the ER. It was 9 o'clock, a crowded scene, Susan on a bed with curtains separating her from others, and with hardly room to stand on either side. Many people checked her various bodily signs. She was still looking with her eyes, but her head was turned to one side only. If I stood on the other side of the bed, she would not turn to me. If I was on the side of the bed she was looking at, she seemed to see me. About midnight, she was admitted to a room on the neurological floor, and I went home. That was the last day she ever spoke to me. The last day she squeezed my hand. The last day she sat beside me. The last day I sat beside her with my arm around her shoulders. The last day she put weight on her feet. The last day she put food in her mouth. I will not hide my shame from my readers or my regret. It was the last day that I was ever cross with her. It is such a trite observation. You never know which day will be the last day. Yet even though trite, it is true. And it would be nearly 2 months still before I would realize that in all those ways, for all those quotidian things, this was the last day. Why should we love a God who makes a world in which such a loss can occur? I think it is because, in the end, there is no alternative. This is simply the God with whom we have to deal. My next section in the book is called The Best Book of the Bible. And this is a spoiler for you if you haven't read it. But the best book of the Bible, I say, is the book of Job. You can see I go from that which I just read to you to Job. This is simply the God with whom we have to deal. He gives us our heart's desire. What the psalmist says does come true, but he also takes it away. And we can't remove we cannot remove the responsibility for taking it away from him. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, just as Job says. This is who he is. But I do love him, for I remember that he did give me Susan. He has given me this life that I have, a life of many good things, blessings, joys, including today the joy of being in Sarasota with you. Most of these blessings and joys and good things I hardly notice. I don't know if you're like this, but I journal. Since Susan died, I have taken up journaling in the morning, and I often think back, well, what did happen yesterday? And I'll remember lots of things that that wasn't so good, was it? And then I'll say, oh, there were some good things that happened, right? But the good things are so easily forgotten. They slip past. God has given me everything. And that is an even deeper mystery than the mystery of his taking it away, right? It's the deepest mystery of all, that everything we have is from God. Well, let me pause there and ask if you would like to ask me anything or say something or file an objection for future reference.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Can you describe what your grief was like?
The question is, can I describe what my grief was like? It was different than anything I expected. I was supported by my fellow clergy at St. Thomas in an amazing way. Susan died, if you know what a church life is like, Susan died on December 17th, about the most inconvenient day of the year, right? There are Christmas carol services, 9 lessons in carols, blah, blah, the whole shebang. And I called the rector and I said, we would like to have the prayer book burial service with the body in the church. So that was, I felt carried along by the fact that I didn't have to figure out what to do. The church had been here before, and I really felt like, and Father Meade knew exactly what I meant, and it all just happened. So I didn't have to do any of that. I could just grieve. I wanted to say Mass. So perhaps the 18th, which would have been a Tuesday. We had evensong on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and I think there was evensong that night, although it may have been just the gentlemen of the choir. I don't remember. But I slipped in towards the end of evensong, and then was the person who said the Mass at the high altar afterwards, which didn't require saying anything that wasn't in the book. You started at the Lord be with you, lift up your hearts. There we are. So it's sort of being carried along. I didn't have to do anything I didn't want to do, but I went to the main services and taught a class the next Sunday morning. So there's I was glad to be able to do those things. I didn't have to stay at the door and shake hands afterwards. I remember I was just afraid I would cry and I don't mind crying, but I didn't think it would be very helpful for others, So anyway, I didn't have to hang around if I didn't want to. It's grief, I have learned, is very personal and different for each person, and it can surprise me, and just even now, just suddenly hit me, and I haven't felt sad for a long time, and then just suddenly it might hit me. But the healing, I would say, the healing of the grief was when I have a book on friendship that's out, and I tell this story at the beginning of the book on friendship, but I was at a conference for clergy that the Church Friendship Fund puts on. And there was a healing Eucharist, and I realized I'd never asked to be healed from her death. So I went, and the people who were praying over me knew that she had died, but they didn't know that I'd never asked for prayers for healing. And the words this woman came up with were, "We thank you, Lord, for giving Victor something that many people never get to experience." And it was suddenly there. Whether she intended it exactly this way or not, what was suddenly there for me was God had given me a marriage of 34 years to my heart's desire. Every marriage will come to an end. every life has a death at the end. This was, even though it had ended, it was still a true gift that God had given me. And so that was the seed of the healing of the whole thing.
How long was she nonverbal?
Increasingly the last decade or so, not completely nonverbal.
Sorry, could you repeat?
Repeat the question. How long was Susan nonverbal? She always very, very much a verbal person. Her, if the highest SAT verbal score is 800, hers was 850. She's that kind of just wonderfully verbal. And that allowed her to cover up. Because I would notice things like we're walking, or she wants to find the word sidewalk, but sidewalk's not coming up. She'll say, where it ends. And then I would think, some of you have gotten it too, right? Where the sidewalk ends, that wonderful book. But that's the sort of, part of the nonverbalness was her lack of where the tumor was. It inhibited her executive function. That's what it's called. So she, along the way, a neuropsychologist had said to me, "You have to be her executive function." Susan came home once from, she'd been in a nursing home for a while for rehab. And our friend Andrew that I mentioned was there, and he had brought her a crossword puzzle. She always liked doing crossword puzzles. And so he says, "Susan, I gave this for you." She took the puzzle, she sat down on the sofa and started doing it. And he says, "Nice to see you too," right? But that's just, easier for her to do that sort of thing than to engage in conversation.
With an extended illness, is might be terminal, but can you describe the grief process as she's still alive?
Oh, yes.
After she passed away?
Yes. The question is, with an extended illness, which is possibly terminal, what's the extended grief process? And I was quite aware of that. We had in our church a sexton who was younger than I and very healthy and died in the gym one morning. No one gets to say goodbye for that. It's the whole, it's like no one gets to care. And it's so different. So in many ways, I had lived as a kind of single person for a while. I don't know that that's exactly how I'd want to put it, but if I have to be her executive function, then we are not living out as sort of the peer, equal friends that is normal for marriage. It's something gladly done out of love, but it's hard, it's hard in that way. So there was a lot of already sort of thinking about it. And I do remember towards the end, it was possible that she would her brain was in clearly an increasingly fragile state, but it was not at all certain that this was the end. We were looking at nursing homes, in fact, at their request, places that could take care of her. And then she suddenly died. But so I was thinking, she might live another decade, 2 decades more, right? How will we do that? And I remember talking to God about this and saying, I don't like this situation. I wish that we'd never got into this, but however this turns out, it's going to be okay with me. That's kind of, I said, however this turns out, be okay. Yeah.
I don't like to think that God takes away.
Yeah.
I like to think that it's free will acting and that He supports what's going to happen.
Yeah.
We lost our friend who was a beautiful young man in AIDS in 1980. Thank heavens for the Church of England. But I don't want to think of God taking me away from us.
Yeah. Yes.
Sadly, down acts
the question is about the questioner does not want to think of God as taking away. Say a 21-year-old son who dies at the age of 21. Don't want to think of God as taking him away. I don't think of God, actually. So this is really a helpful question. I don't think of God as saying on December 17th, 2012, I'm going to take Susan away from Victor and bring her home. Yeah. No. But God is responsible for the world that has cancer in it. We cannot, I think, get God off the hook for a world where bad things happen, or things that are bad for human beings happen. That's just the world that is. So it's in that sense that I mean. And I think, by the way, that's what Job comes to see at the end. He sees a wild world full of many animals that would just kill a human being instantly and not think twice about it. We know that the universe is full of all kinds of space where we could not survive. And the earth itself has regions where we could not survive. And it has viruses and all kinds of other things that hurt us. So that's one piece of the question about evil. It seems to me that if we've got, that God in a way is saying, this is the world I've given you. I don't know. Yeah. But I do not think that God then acts with that kind of direct intent. Yeah. Is that okay? Does that help a little? We probably won't know till later on. That's very much true. I mean, for me, the question is when I was 39 and I started my doctoral work, I discovered that Thomas Aquinas believed stuff that I had never in my life heard. For instance, Aquinas believes that God causes my free actions, that there's no way I can understand God as creator and put a space between him and what I'm doing like right now. He causes them exactly as free actions. So with God, that's not a contradiction, you know. If I slipped something into your drink and then you started doing something crazy, you could say, well, Father Austin caused it, not me. It's not my fault. It's in the drink. But God's not that way. You know, God's not something else in the universe. So God, it's part of the mystery of God. So we're not allowed that, which I'd always thought, you know, God sets us free and then he's kind of surprised maybe or disappointed or we can't. But they are still free. I mean, I cannot get my head around that. But that would mean that God could have made a world where everyone was free and no one ever chose badly. And the next question is, well, why didn't he make that world? And the totally unsatisfactory answer to that is we're not allowed to ask that question because God is not a sort of being that can have anything, can have any obligation laid upon him. God doesn't have, there's no outside obligation. So there's no saying God has to make a world that we think would be better than the world we have. And that's a question. That's the question I look forward to asking at the end. Why did you make a world where people could choose to murder or cheat, etc., etc.? clearly we believe that in heaven we will be free. So the life to come is going to be a life full of free beings. And nonetheless, none of us, should we be there, none of those who are in paradise are going to do anything wrong, right? So when we think about heaven, we are clearly thinking about a world where everyone is free and yet no one is going to choose in that freedom to do something wrong.
Earlier you spoke about healing and grief. And do you ever feel healed if you are still grieving? Are they separate? Are they always go hand in hand?
To repeat the question, it's about healing and grief. Does one ever feel healed if there's still grief around? Or do grief and healing kind of always stick together? I think the honest recognition that a very sad thing has occurred is true, and thus it's always going to be true, right? Even though one also recognizes that that's part of the package of a very good thing. So that package of the good that God has given includes within it this grief that's happened. The friends meet with Job at the very end of his book. His friends, his family, all of his acquaintances, they bring him gifts, and it says, they comforted Job. At the beginning of the book, his friends arrive, and they are not, they with the intention of comforting him, but they're not able to comfort him. As we know, I mean, if you've read any of the book, right, they just, very quickly, they're like this. But their intention in coming was to comfort Job. But when they arrive, they just sit around and weep. They weep with Job. They have no, they have nothing to say to Job. And it's Job who speaks first. I think that's a really good model of friendship. But anyway, not what follows, but there at the beginning. At the end, they're with Job, and the Bible says they comforted Job over the evils that the Lord brought upon him. So there's that beautiful, warm picture of communion. I don't think it's too much to call that scene at the end of the book of Job at least a foretaste of communion. It's a meal, and everyone's together, human community, and strengthening one another, and nonetheless not denying that God did bring evil things upon Job. Or at least that's what the text calls them. But that's not to say I've got this all wrapped up. It's just, it seems to me all these things I need to say, and I don't know how to say them all. Just try to hold them. So.
My wife died last month. Her name was Debbie.
God bless you.
She had dementia. She was able to do a few physical things, eat, that's about it. She lost all emotion, which was probably the hardest part for me. And I remember twice this happened. Once she was sitting on the sofa together, and I did not create this. It just came to my mind, just in a flash. When's Debbie coming back?
Mm-hmm.
It took me, back a minute. I didn't know how to react to that. And I still don't.
Yeah.
Dealing with that and some other things too. But the fact that I didn't manufacture that thought, it just came to me like that twice. When's Debbie coming back?
Yeah. The question is about dementia and when one has a beloved who has dementia, one might well wonder, when is this person coming back? When is Debbie coming back? It's a good question. I suppose, and just let me say, it's hearing you say that is one of the reasons why I don't want to say I had a particularly hard hand dealt to me, because I never had. Susan always knew who I was, unless she was in a coma. And I know people who don't have that, and how hard it is. I do know that when she was in a coma, I felt I could talk to her and touch her, say a prayer with her, assure her in whatever way. And what came to me, I remember at that time, was the idea that the body is the sacrament of presence. So the body, I knew Susan was there even though she was in a coma, because the body was there, right? The body is the sacrament of presence. It's a much harder thing, I think, to believe when you have something like dementia. Still, I guess I would want to try to believe it. So I hate to, just what my mind would be telling me, whether I could ever believe it in my heart, but what my mind would be telling me is that her brain is damaged in such a way that she cannot use it. The brain is part of the body, and so it's like having legs that you can't use. So this brain it's working well enough for her to breathe and eat, but it's not working well enough for her to interact with the world. But God bless you.